The most dangerous thing about Trump, to me, is he is a deeply unserious person who seeks the most serious office in the entire world. And that means that you have to look at things and take things on with a degree of, there's some empathy there. You have to think beyond yourself. You have to think for other people, and he doesn't have the capability to do that.
Yeah, but Van, what responsibility do the people of North Carolina have for voting for someone like Mark Robinson? I mean, I don't know if you can put all of that on Trump. I mean, people do have some level of autonomy to decide, I'm going to vote for someone who's a disgrace, or I'm going to vote for someone with values and standards.
Well,
and some people clearly chose to vote for Robinson.
That gets us back to the divide in our country, right? I think that gets us back to what we're asking ourselves. We're asking ourselves if we can actually depend on half of the country as Americans to actually put country and democracy and things like that first, and not just the whims of one guy.
And both of those things can be true at the same time.
No, absolutely.
I mean, voters do have the responsibility to vote for people who are not, off the deep end. But that does not absolve Trump from his responsibility he actually embraced Mark Robinson when all of this stuff. So much of this stuff was out here, not just the latest porn stuff, but a lot of the other stuff. Trump brought him in. Trump elevated him. He did not have to do that.
I accept that point, Abby, but I will say, from my understanding, the campaign recognizes the problem that Mark Robinson is. Now, okay, better late than never. And the former president is attempting to distance himself from Mr. Robinson. I think J.D. Vance was supposed to do an event with him, I think, a day or two ago. They canceled that event. Robinson wasn't invited to the Trump event, I think, today or tomorrow. And so I think you're going to see this continue. I think the bigger question for me, though, is what does the Republican Party of North Carolina do? I mean, granted, they can't kick the guy off the ballot, but they don't necessarily have to support him either.
They could have done this 2 weeks ago.
Well,
Why didn't they?
That's why, I mean, I don't think we've had an opposition research failure this big since 2017 when we didn't see Governor Northam's blackface photo.
But no, look, this is an opposition research failure?
It is. He had an opponent that spent $10 million and didn't do any research. So whoever ran that race, I don't know who it was, but they need to reevaluate how they do it.
For months.
Yeah. By the way, we can talk about what was found on Nude Africa or any of these other sites, but the guy, to me, in his rhetoric, was disqualifying way before this.
Of course, he
was
exactly.
Like he was disqualifying.
So wait, he wasn't a terrible candidate because, to Sharmuka's point, he actually won his primary.
Of course.
And he won principally because he has become a Trump acolyte.
Yeah.
And that is, we have seen all across the country where Donald Trump has embraced people who flatter him.
He came from the internet.
He embraces people who flatter him and go all the way out, as far as Donald Trump needs them to go.
And I'll say something real quick to you
that is not something that mainstream Republicans have historically done.
About the voters of North Carolina.
These guys have.
Voters vote. People who are actually voters, they vote, right? Cultists obey.
Yes.
And I know that is probably triggering to people, but voters are people who go out and they look at policy, they look at their
So you don't think the people who, I'm not saying that
No.
Mark
What I
Robinson
think,
was my candidate, do you not think that there was something, whether it was his articulation of this populist anger that people saw, they believed it and said, all right, you know what, this guy's speaking to my plight, my critique of the political party, the political establishment, the government writ large, he has my vote.
I think all of that language is translated through Donald Trump's aura. And I think right now there's such a capture on the right. And to be honest with you, a lot of conservatives that I talk to, a lot of friends of mine, I'm from Louisiana, it's not like I don't know Kirk, I'm as liberal as they come, but they want their party back. And what Ben Shapiro is actually saying right there is forget about Trump and flattering him and everything that you just said. They want conservatism back that they can be proud of, and they don't see it in a lot of.
But they had a chance to get their party back. They had a chance for months to get their party back.
I understand that, but there is something to a third of the country supporting the former president, and I don't think we can necessarily discard that. What is it about this grievance that these people are asking for political leaders to pay attention to? The Republican Party, the establishment in particular, had a long time, Van, to address these issues. They had a long time, the Tea Party. They had a long time to address some of this, and they didn't do it.
I do want to hear
and so here we go with Donald Trump.
But then I have a follow-up question for you.
I think their grievances, and I look at this as like a good old boy. I think their grievances had to do with the realization that they could be in a post-Obama America, where their very existence, and look, I'll give some ground here. I personally think that in Obama's first and second term, a lot of my friends were looking at the political landscape and they were saying there'll never be another Republican president for 25 or 30 years. And I think there were people that come from places like we come from that maybe felt a little alienated. But I do think that mutated. I think it mutated into something that was anti-American, anti-black, anti-trans, anti-gay, anti-woman. And I think that if conservatives want to have a real voice in America moving forward, they got to take their party back.
Yeah, but that's half of America, though, Van.
But Chair Michael, can you address the substance of what he just said? Do you think that an element of the support for people like Mark Robinson is motivated by those things that he just ticked off?
I mean, Mark Robinson is
I'm not
black.
saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying,
I don't know
do
in
you
terms
think
of
that his
the racial
diagnosis
elements
is
of it.
Nazi?
I'm not necessarily sure. But I do think Mark Robinson did speak to a grievance, a very real grievance, that a lot of voters in that state believed he was the best representation to actualize those grievances in some real terms.
But what are the grievances? I think he was saying
I think the grievances could have been they felt economically behind. They feel that in terms of their academic attainment for their children, they're falling behind. I mean, I could go on and on. I'm not saying that.
And how does Mark Robinson's
but what I'm saying though, Abby, if you looked at some of his statements in the past, I think observing some of the statements, I think a part of the reason a lot of those people voted for him was when he's saying the culture is changing and people are allowing certain things that we don't agree to.
But I think people. We got to let this go.
But I'm just saying, I think people.
Hang on one second.
I think
We're
people
forgetting
believe
we
in that.
had Donald Trump as
We have
president
to.
for
We have
4 years
to. We have to
and
go.
Joe Biden for the last 3.
But let's be clear about what the kinds of things Mark Robinson said.
I know what he said, Abby. I'm not excusing
He was
it.
saying, let's go back to Jim Crow.
Yes.
He was saying women should pull their skirts down so that they don't get pregnant and then they won't need abortions. If that's going to take people back
Abby,
to that era, then I think we should just be honest
I think
about
we
what
could
that's about.
ignore that, but I do think there are some people who do believe the culture of the society has gone too far in one direction. And I think there are certain individuals who appear to speak to that for some of those people, and they're clearly supporting them.
I just think that at this
But I
table,
don't think it's
we try to.
normalizing it, though. I don't
We
think
got to
it is.
go.
I think the question is,
hold on a
what
second.
should the Trump campaign do now?
We gotta
What should
go.
Republicans do now? You move forward.
We got to go. At this table, we try to keep it real. It just sounds like, it sounds kind of like you're just papering over
Oh, come on,
things.
Abby. Seriously?
Seriously.
So now I'm supporting Mark Robinson here?
I didn't say that you're supporting him. I just think that it sounds like you're trying to put frilly language around
That's
this
not
guy
what.
who's
That's no. That's
making-
not. No,
This
it's
is
not what I'm saying at
someone
all.
who
Even
mocked
people in your
What
party
I'm
is
saying.
survivors.
What I'm saying is, as I observe this, like as a conservative, and I'm thinking about why are people supporting people like this. I'm wondering what is it about these people and what they see in our society that they personally believe is diabolically changing against what they think America should look like, and why they're attempting
it's in
to
spite of it.
actualize those things and protect those things with people like A. Robinson.